Let me introduce myself first. I'm Danielle Martin. I'm from ICMM, the International Council on Mining Metals, and it's a joy to be here with you today, particularly with this esteemed panel that I will introduce again very briefly in just one moment. But before I start, of course, I would like to acknowledge that we meet today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to them and to all First Nations people here today. We also do a land acknowledgement at ICMM now, wherever we meet anywhere around the world, to acknowledge the Indigenous and land-connected peoples on which mining takes place, and to recognise the impacts, both negative and positive, that mining has on them. So, our panel need no further introduction, really, given that we've just done that, but we have Christina, Chris, Ian, Vanessa and JP, and I'm delighted to be talking with you all today. Quickly to set the scene before I hand over to the panel, I wanted to refer to some stats to frame up what we're about to talk about. So there are more than 476 million Indigenous peoples worldwide, and they make up just over 6% of the global population. Indigenous peoples are recognised for managing about 25% of the Earth's land surface. And this is land that coincides with about 80% of the planet's biodiversity and 40% of the world's terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples make up about 15% of the world's poor and are deeply impacted by the long-term consequences of historic injustices, including colonisation and the dispossession of their lands. And while mining has had a long history of engaging and partnering with Indigenous people, mining has impacted, often negatively, the rights and lives of peoples, communities and the land. So we're here to talk today about recognising First Nations and developing better Indigenous partnerships that support shared prosperity. ICMM's been thinking really deeply about this over the last 18 months as we rewrite our member commitments on Indigenous people's participation in mining. We're thinking deeply about topics like recognition and reconciliation, consent, how we better respect and incorporate Indigenous knowledge into mining, how we make agreements, how we share benefits, and of course how we protect cultural heritage, just to name a few. We're working with our members and a range of external stakeholders to set a new standard for how mining engages with Indigenous people and seeks greater participation. And we aim to release that next year, so stay tuned. Enough from me, let's hear from the panel. So we wanted to talk first about where are we coming from? So what's important to recognise the past and current relationships that mining has with Indigenous peoples in order that we can move forward. And I want to start, JP, with you. You've got more than 30 years experience in the natural resources sector across Indigenous communities and organisations, environmental NGOs, industry and government. So a great vast perspective. What do you think is important to note about where we are now in terms of how we go forward?
Thank you, Danielle. It's important to note that every country in its relationships with Indigenous peoples is at a different pace. Some are further along, and depending how you define what further along than others. I'm a Canadian First Nation person who sits on a number of corporate boards, as well as working for my communities when it comes to natural resource development. And I can speak from the perspective as a Canadian First Nation person, and we've come a very long way in our relationship with the land, with the governments, with industry. We've come from a place where initially it was tough to get jobs, but now any Indigenous person that is qualified and ready for work has work. Our supply chains and our procurement activities, close to $50 billion in the supply chains across Canada are now being fulfilled by Indigenous people. We're at a place now in Canada where Indigenous people and communities are actually starting to become major asset owners of infrastructure, whether that's mining, renewables, oil and gas. There's a saying, and I know Florence is going to enjoy this, that all paths to net zero run through the traditional territories of our communities. So we play a very integral role in Canada's story. And there is a really great, if you're familiar with the Globe and Mail, it's one of our national papers, and there is a Report on Business, which is a very prominent business magazine of the biggest businesses in the country. And the caption on the cover page is of a First Nation woman from the West Coast, LNG, and it says, why Canada's future depends on economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities. Our country is going fast and is going forward in partnership with communities, and it's quite an exciting place to be.
Thanks, JP. That's an interesting headline. Yeah, certainly so pertinent to the conversation we're having today. Christina, I want to go to you. You bring perspective both from women in the industry via your role in IWIMRA, but also your role with EY as the National Talent Acquisition Manager. What strikes you as important about the current state of play?
Yeah, I think the current state of play, Danielle, is we understand as the relations between, or the correlation between mining and Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. Fundamentally, we're caretakers, you know, like we're that sustainable piece from that cultural aspect that is creating longevity for, you know, the land and culture. The relationship between mining and Indigenous communities has been such a precarious one since its inception. Fundamentally, we've understand that although we've seen some fantastic partnerships with traditional owners and Indigenous land uses agreements around the country, from exploration to, you know, site formation through to production, through to community development, what we also understand is when things go wrong, they really go wrong. We have a breakdown in communication. We have that shared value, that shared understanding, or that the understanding of each party is not really realised. And so for us, that amplifies because ultimately we have a large industry, but it's not really large when something goes wrong. It's very much amplified throughout the nation, but then again globally. If I may make reference to, I guess some would say, the elephant in the room, our recent referendum, our voice to Parliament. So overall, we know as a nation, the vote was no, understandably. But regardless how each and every individual in this room voted, and at this point, it doesn't really matter. But what that referendum has done for us as a nation it's unveiled, I guess, a gap in education for us on a societal level. And it's now given us an accountability mechanism for industries, for governments, for us to be able to use that as the cornerstone to say, look, you know what, this doesn't stop progress, this doesn't stop us from incorporating our Indigenous women into the conversation, our Indigenous communities at the forefront of what creating change looks like. So I think the biggest thing for me to understand is that we need to use this as a discussion point. And you know what? It's okay to be vulnerable because within vulnerability, there's strength. And to have these open and honest, robust conversations, I think it's a great thing.
Thanks, Christina. Talking about kind of thinking progressively and about taking things forward, Chris, I want to come to you. BHP has recently revised its Indigenous peoples policy to emphasise priority for shared value, so the topic of today. And you head up the Indigenous procurement function globally, which is, you know, clearly very important to economic opportunity. So what do you take forward from past and current relationships between mining and Indigenous peoples in this work?
Thanks, Danielle. It's a good question. I think there's lots of things we need to take forward, but if I had to pick a couple, I think the right level of focus and commitment to delivering sustainable change is one. And I think another is a real willingness to have authentic engagements and communications and take feedback and be willing to, you know, adapt the way you work are two really critical examples. And on the first one, you mentioned our Indigenous peoples policy. We have a new reconciliation action plan in Australia. All of these are really important things to anchor the whole company back to make sure that everybody can understand, you know, what we're committed to and why that's important. And then, you know, teams like Procurement can take those and make sure our work is really embedding those, so it takes away the need for individual choice and it just becomes part of the way we work. And we also need to obviously deliver outcomes now, but we need to have a really long-term view around the sustainability of those partnerships as well. It can't just be sort of ad hoc short-term things. And example, if I wasn't here today, we have a partner, Northwest Waste Alliance in WA, who's celebrating their 10-year anniversary, and they've been a partner of our business for a decade. And we see every day the importance and what that long-term partnership can deliver, not just the work that they do for us, but the other opportunities that it creates through their supply chain and the different involvement that they can bring. So I think that's the first one. And on the second piece, around those meaningful engagements and being willing to listen. I've talked about the Reconciliation Action Plan already, but that's an example of how we're working differently. This time we didn't write that in a room. That was the product of many, many conversations with traditional owners and Indigenous groups across the country to test our thinking and get feedback to make sure that something meaningful came out at the end. And that's the same reason my team exists. My team exists out of conversations that BHP could do more and could do better. And having a team to really focus on driving this change is where that came from.
Great, thanks, Chris. And I love that concept of conversations happening, as opposed to kind of mining, doing it itself in a room. Ian, I want to come to you. You bring exemplar experience in government, and the list of social services and NGO organisations that you advise is extensive. So what's your view on the lessons we have learnt that will serve us well into the future?
Thanks for that. I think the lessons we have learned is when we look back, where have we been? It's probably the lesson that's staring us straight in the face. I've only been here this morning, and yet I've heard us and the other two speakers, although IWIMRA is making a small inroad into this, it's like there's the mining sector and then there's the blackfellas, right? I'll just use that for Indigenous term for wherever people are from, including Canada. We're all blackfellas. It is like we are two groups occupying the same space at the same time, almost in competition. That is a lesson we have to get over. That cannot continue. I suppose if I was to say the key lessons, don't think of us as competitive stakeholders for your interests. That's actually not a thing. We're actually a business that you partner with. If we were any other business, you'd be in partnership with us. Why are we still thought of as stakeholders to be managed? And stakeholders are a bit like shareholders. They're a necessary I can't say the word, irritant, that's it. They're a necessary irritant that you have to deal with. I think one of the lessons is a conceptual mind shift, that we are not something that to be dealt with, but a partner to be worked with. I think also that thing of having Aboriginal people in decision making around the business more generally. There is still, and I again this morning, I get the feeling that gains that have been done with Indigenous people, such as bringing economic opportunity, such as bringing infrastructure, such as bringing other things, is often considered as a secondary thing that we can accommodate when we can afford it, or if it's okay, rather than is that part of our core business. This goes to a deeper thing which the mining sector and every other sector needs to contemplate at the moment. The world expects more of its corporations than maximisation of profit and return to shareholders. We expect you to contribute to the society in which you live and the places that you operate. In our case, that means more than just doing things when there's opportunity with Aboriginal people, but basically society expects to see more and more. I think Danielle, just quickly, the other thing that I'd really like to think, the lesson, I hope people start to think about having Aboriginal people, as I said, in decision-making perspective. As I said, I sit on a whole bunch of boards. I'm a non-executive director for a living. I sit on the board of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. This is my stuff. I'd like to see Aboriginal people in the boardroom. If this was any other significant partner that Indigenous people are, surely to goodness you'd have them engaged at the highest levels in the boardroom, if not the senior executives, rather than being managed over here as this other group of people. So I think the lesson is to reconceptualise our relationship so that we can actually all benefit from each other.
I can see JP really just bursting to come in there. Do you want to? I want to give Vanessa the chance.
Absolutely. But after Vanessa, I'll jump in if that's all right.
Let him go. JP, go for it.
Thanks, Vanessa. Absolutely. you know, I'm also sit on the board of Suncor, and we're a company that spent $3.1 billion last year on the Indigenous economy in entrepreneurs. We also have assets in the billions of dollars that are co-owned with Indigenous people in the region. I also sit on BHP's Forum for Corporate Responsibility and do a lot of work. This is about taking the best in the world and applying it to what you're doing. And you've got some incredible Indigenous leaders at the front of the room here, part of your country. Draw from this experience. These are partnerships, these are people, these are opportunities to do things better. Economic reconciliation should be viewed as your competitive edge, not as an irritant. I'm sorry, I had to jump in. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like the headline in the article that you read out this morning is starting to really hone in on that point. So thanks, JP. Vanessa, I wanted to save the final word for you on this question, and then obviously we'll move to the next round. You recently spoke to ICMM's membership about the importance of recognising the past in order to go forward. So what observations do you make either from that experience or from the conversation that we're having today?
I think that it's really important that we all understand the plurality of what it means to be First Nations, first of all, and the unique rights of those that call themselves and are legally recognised in jurisdictions as traditional owners. Secondly, the heritage and care for country value of being custodians. Thirdly, the entity orientation of First Nations as authorities. And lastly, us as game changers. Because I've worked in this industry for 25 years. I grew up around mining, around diamonds, gold, and now rare earth. And we were that light on the hill far away. We were those that were excluded. And then we chose to educate ourselves, to rise up and renegotiate our position. But to do that, you need to position yourself in the right place at the right time for the right purpose. And there's no one on the planet right now that understands the conundrum that the industry has as it relates to climate change and climate adaptation than First Nations peoples. We have been holding that cultural continuum for more than 65,000 years. Where I come from, we've also been holding the cultural jamming process of colonial mistrust, displacement, rendered invisible, and the conflict and confrontation that comes from that. And the ability to forgive, to occupy your space, to rise up, develop your own discipline and discourse to say, we all need to sit at that table. And what that has meant for me is a cross-sectoral career of negotiating native title on behalf of traditional owners, on behalf of the Crown, okay, state and federal government, and on behalf of companies, and then in more recent time being on boards that finance these sorts of productivity. So the biggest message I want to give everyone in the room, any relationship that you have, time is important, and we need to move away from the just-in-time scheduling of Indigenous stage gate decision-making points. It needs to be a cultural continuum, and you need to learn from us how to create business continuity that forms relationships, right? And every relationship has up, downs, and roundabouts, right? But we need to do that because your greatest ally is going to be First Nations people. And you need to encounter us outside of a regulatory framework. And the only way you can ever demonstrate the productivity of any relationship is to look at who is in the position of poverty and vulnerability. So the translation of what we all have to do in this room is about economic inclusion. That is the greatest measure that we all offer. And we must come up with ways to define that and work together to achieve that.
Thanks, Vanessa. I knew that our time slot for this panel would be far too short. So the next round's going to be super quick. Vanessa, I'll stick with you. You have the mic in hand. So just building on what you've just said, you know, in terms of going forward, building better partnerships between Indigenous peoples and mining that support shared prosperity. What's your sort of 1 minute must-do takeaway for us in the room?
Well, I've been panning this room thinking, who can I see? And I can see you, Rome. So I'm going to handball this to you and acknowledge you because I've did a bit of work with you and your leadership team. And we can't be just pop-up experiences at conferences, and we can't be pop-up experiences for reconciliation action plans. So I'm going to handball my 1 minute to you, Ro. And if it's okay, under your leadership and through Danielle, can we have an enduring dialogue about this? Because we really need to co-design a discipline and a discourse that will take us forward that we all feel safe with. Is that a minute?
Thanks, Vanessa. That was very, very concise. I love your challenge for ICMM, and through the work that we're doing at the moment with our Indigenous people's position statement, that very much aligns, and I very much hope that we can take up that challenge. So we'll be talking after this. Ian, over to you if I can. Your experience includes football, water, heritage, housing, community development, and so much more. So from that perspective, how do we, what do we need to take forward this ambition for better partnerships in 1 minute?
Okay, building on what I said before, I think the biggest thing to do is to recognise Aboriginal people or Indigenous people have a lot to offer beyond just the transactional business of mining, for example. We can actually make really big contribution to the more broader common welfare, the more broader economy. In return, and backing up what you said, Christina, social justice, if you like, politics and referendums and whatnot, has probably run its course. How do you uplift Aboriginal people? And we deserve to be, not deserve, we have a right to be uplifted to the same place as our fellow Australians. And as was said in the Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid. That's how we do it. And as Catherine King said, the Australian mining sector is such a huge part of the Australian economy. Surely to goodness you have an obligation, if not to us, to yourselves, to do something to help us achieve just an equity with our fellow Australians. That's probably the biggest thing that I would say is focus on the bigger contribution you can make, not simply, as I said before, maximum profit return to shareholders. And just to be clear, Milton Friedman was wrong. I'm a Keynesian. Any of you who are economists will know what that means.
Thanks,
An
Ian.
Aboriginal person talking economics, that's new.
Thanks, Ian. Chris, you guys are doing this, right? Shared prosperity is baked into what you're doing. So what does it look like from your perspective and what's working well?
I think fundamentally we need to continue to do more. So we need to find more of the ongoing sustainable opportunities, not the short-term contracting opportunities in procurement, but the more long-term, better opportunities that allow employment, allow businesses to invest and buy assets, build productivity and become more and more sustainable. Not just that, but continue to push ourselves to find ways to create ongoing revenue streams. So it's not just relying on a contract with BHP. It is a truly resilient business that can sustain into the future. So I think that's one really important piece. I think the second one is, we have a role to play in building capability as well, not just for businesses that are working with us to achieve our own objectives. We can do that daily. We can simplify our contracts. We can make it better to work with BHP. We can provide, the right support for new businesses who are mobilising. But we're also focused more broadly on the Aboriginal contracting sector of supporting new businesses who want to work in mining, whether it's, through our Trading Tracks program, which we've started in Queensland and just announced this month, our Pilbara program. That's available to businesses whether they're working in mining or not. If they need help setting up or getting marketing advice or coaching on how to submit a tender, I think that's really important and something that we're very committed to, so that we can continue to create capacity in the Indigenous contracting sector. And the last one is we have work to do with our non-Indigenous Tier 1 partners as well. So we've been very focused on our direct supply chain and how we can do better. But we've got to come together more broadly. There's a huge supply chain out there that we're not utilising to its full extent. When we want to find these ongoing and sustainable opportunities, we've got to come together and really be leveraging that full supply chain. So that's our focus.
Thanks, Chris. Christina, to you, from your experience in leading positive change and transformation, what do you think is needed here?
So I'm looking at the time running out, and I had notes prepared, but I'm just going to ad-lib.
Wing it.
We have Indigenous people are overrepresented in so many aspects of Australia. Overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the justice sector, prisons, out of home care, mortality rates. Indigenous people die 10 to 12 years less than our non-Indigenous counterparts. We are so underrepresented in all those aspects, and we have been for so many years. But then we're underrepresented in the mining industry. So that's a stark contrast for us to be able to understand that state of play is somewhat equal. So I think if we stop having these fluffy, feel-good conversations and start getting down to the nuts and bolts and really changing the oil on this machine, we can really start to move forward and create change in a more sustainable way. All of my colleagues on the panel here have just spoken from the heart and with such fierce fire. I think we need to take what we're saying and actually embed that into what we're doing in industry.
Maybe change the oil or rebuild the machine, something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. JP, the last word is to you. Obviously, our topic includes the words recognition, partnerships, shared prosperity. How do we take this forward?
Just have courage. I mean, my bio, 30 plus years I've been at this, and I can tell you where we are today is where we were 30 years ago. Have the courage so we can point those social indicators which are pointing in the wrong way for our people in the right way. And, the next time somebody says, if you don't know, vote no. If you don't know, understand, get to know, so you can make an informed decision and meet with these incredible people in your country. Have the courage.
I was going to do a quick summary to our panelist session as our clock is saying 0, but instead I just wrote down some words that you mentioned as we went through this, and I want to just leave these words with you all. We heard about game changers, partners, competitive advantage, better decision making, contribution, long-term relationships, courage. Would each of you just like to add one more word to that list? Vanessa, we'll start with you and we'll go down the list and then we'll finish up.
I think belonging to the equation.
Enabling self-determination.
Build trust.
Bravery.
I was going to go with trust as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, panel. Everyone, would you please thank our fabulous panel?